All right, so autonomic nervous system. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, one of the things we like to do is compare it to somatic, because those are the two options for motor output in the peripheral nervous system. And then the other thing we like to do is just look at what it does, because it actually has a lot of different functions, including a variety of reflexes that are very different from the somatic reflexes that we just looked at. So autonomic nervous system has a couple of different names. You can abbreviate it to ANS. It's been called the involuntary nervous system. And also because the effectors are generally in the viscera, the internal organs, it's also been called the visceral motor system. And so its major job is to maintain homeostasis. And it does it by using smooth muscle and exocrine glands, and also heart muscle to mediate its responses. It also has some interaction with endocrine glands, which we'll touch on today, and you'll get to see that more in your second semester as well. So when we look at the autonomic versus the somatic, the major difference is, of course, the effectors. So the somatic is how we control the skeletal muscles, and of course, everything else is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. As we're going to see today, the motor pathways are actually a little bit different too. So in the somatic, we have that single lower motor neuron that comes from the central nervous system out to the skeletal muscle effectors. But when we have motor output in the autonomic nervous system, there's actually two neurons in the peripheral that form a chain. And so we'll see how that works today, but it means that there's always going to be a ganglion involved and a synapse in the peripheral nervous system for the autonomic. Another big difference is that the somatic nervous system is very, very fast. So the motor neurons for skeletal muscle are typically heavily myelinated, which means that the signal travels very fast. Whereas in the autonomic, the axons are either only lightly myelinated or sometimes they're unmyelinated, which means that the signal is going to travel much slower. And that's because these responses aren't meant to be lightning fast. They also typically last longer. And so there's just no need for all that myelination. The neurotransmitters are actually pretty similar. Acetylcholine is the most common neurotransmitter at synapses between motor neurons and their effectors. There is norepinephrine used in parts of the autonomic nervous system though, and we'll look at how that works briefly today too. So the autonomic nervous system itself has two opposing divisions. The sympathetic is, we kind of abbreviate it as fight or flight, although there's a lot more to it than that. And the parasympathetic, we say rest and digest, because fight or flight was coined a long time ago, and people wanted something equally catchy for the opposite division, so they kind of come up with that. But those are just very short, catchy things that don't really encompass all that they do. But if it helps you kind of remember overall what these two divisions do, then by all means remember it. Now, both divisions innervate almost all of the effectors of the system. So we call that dual innervation, and they almost always have opposing actions, although there are some exceptions, and we'll touch on one of them later. So this is another kind of compare and contrast. So as our division of action, our sympathetic system tends to get activated by stress. And so some of the things that it'll do, for example, it'll cause your pupils to dilate, increase your respiratory rate, increase your heart rate, and it'll slow down your gut. Because all of those things are meant to prepare you for potentially running or fighting for your life. So you want to maximize oxygen intake, you want to maximize blood flow to your skeletal muscles because they're probably going to be doing a lot. And you don't want to divert blood to things like digestion, which are not necessary in a moment-to-moment situation. So that's a very abbreviated version of what this does. And the parasympathetic tends to be the opposite. The parasympathetic is active when it is safe to have a meal and it is safe to relax. And so typically the heart rate is slower. When the parasympathetic has control, your breathing is slower. Your pupils are smaller as well. It's not necessary to have a lot of light intake because you're not like trying to see all the danger. You know, you're able to digest, so blood flow goes back to your guts and other organs. So I just like having a couple of summaries at the beginning to help give us a starting point. Now, like I said, sympathetic responses are more than just fight or flight. We don't have a lot of time to go into that, but if you're curious about other forms of stress response, here are some interesting articles to read. And if not, don't worry about it. But it's definitely more than just fighting or flighting. So we know that sometimes people will freeze with a stress response, and there are other more complex responses as well. So now we're going to look at the anatomy of the two divisions with some more comparing and contrasting, including the differences in neurotransmitter use. So the major anatomical differences, again, they really are opposite to each other. So basically what's true of one is typically the opposite of what's true for the other. So all the axons of the sympathetic nervous system come out of the spinal cord in either thoracic or lumbar spinal cord segments. The preganglionic axons, so the first motor neuron axons, typically very short. The ganglia, where those synapses take place, are typically right by the spine. So remember, we kind of briefly looked at that sympathetic trunk, and I said I'd talk more about it. This is where we're at. So they're short because they don't have to go very far. Then they go in there and they synapse, and then the second neuron has to send its axons all the way to the effectors. So they're typically very long. The opposite is true in the PNS. So parasympathetic fibers come out of the brain, so a lot of them are in our cranial nerves, and then some of them come out of sacral spinal cord segments. So completely opposite. The first axons, those fibers are typically really long. The ganglia for the parasympathetic nervous system are actually right next to the organs. So we actually have these little you know, clusters of gray matter right by our heart, our lungs, our digestive system, where we have synapses with the parasympathetic nervous system motor neurons. So we'll look at all this more later. I'll show you diagrams and stuff, but this is the summary of those differences. So sympathetic division, because the axons come out of the thoracolumbar segments, it'll actually also be called sometimes a thoracolumbar division. Because the ganglia are right by the vertebrae, we actually call them vertebral ganglia, although there are a couple that are different. And something that's unique about the sympathetic nervous system is that sweat glands, the erector pili muscles of your hairs, and then the smooth muscle of arteries and veins are all under sympathetic innervation with no axons from the parasympathetic. So while most things have dual innervation, these are some exceptions to that rule. So when we look at the spinal cord anatomy, we see that the sympathetic motor neurons have their cell bodies in those lateral horns that we don't have throughout the entire spinal column. So whereas we always have these dorsal horns, which are all the sensory neurons, and we always have the ventral horns, which are the somatic motor neurons, the lateral horns only are there in the thoracolumbar segments because that's where sympathetic neurons have their bodies, cell bodies. They come out and the ganglion run the entire length of the spinal cord, even though the axons are only coming out from the middle. And that allows the axons, the really long postganglionic axons, to run from the chain out to their effectors, whether that's up to the head, whether that's the thorax or the abdomen. So we use those, I don't know if I made a slide for this. So we use the whole preganglionic, postganglionic, because of course, there's a synapse inside of a ganglion in between, right? So that's how we avoid confusion when we're talking about two motor neurons in a pathway getting between the central nervous system and their effectors. Pretty sure I have a close-up of that in a second. So the preganglionic fibers exit the spinal cord by the ventral root, because that's where all motor axons come out of the spinal cord, and they enter into the sympathetic ganglion, those vertebral ganglion, by the white ramus communicans. So then these vertebral ganglion, which are also called the sympathetic trunk or chain, because they're all connected together like links on a chain, are where we're going to have synapses. And as I said, the trunk itself actually runs the entire length of the spinal cord, so it runs from neck to pelvis, even though the preganglionic fibers are only coming out from the thoracic and lumbar spinal nerve segments. So we have the white ramus. All right, so let me go through this real quick so we don't get confused. Okay, so here's the ventral root of the spinal nerve, right? And remember that then the dorsal root comes together, we have a spinal nerve, and then there's branches, right? So we're gonna have a dorsal branch, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, little meningeal branch, and then we have these little rami communicans. And so that's the link between the sympathetic nervous system and the spinal nerves. So the white one is carrying motor output, so preganglionic axons. And then the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons are in these ganglia. And in order for their axons to move out to their effector organs, they're going to come back up by this gray ramus communicans after synapsing to then go other places. So this sympathetic trunk, this chain of ganglia running along on either side of the vertebrae, it's a major highway for the movement of these axons to get to their destinations. So it's the sympathetic nervous system's equivalent to those plexuses that we talked about the other day, right? So with the plexuses, we have all these axons changing over so that they end up heading the right direction. This is the same concept. So there's actually a couple of different options for those preganglionic neurons as they enter into the sympathetic trunk through those white ramus communicans, because they don't all synapse at that same ganglia. Although they can, sometimes they actually synapse at another ganglia, so they actually travel up or down the spinal cord or up and down the chain first, or they synapse at a third option, which is it's something called a collateral ganglion. Because of course, these sympathetic trunks are not the only ganglia that the sympathetic nervous system has. Why would they do that? That would be too simple and well organized, right? So of course, they're gonna have at least one other option. So, although this is the easiest one to think of, this is very straightforward. You know, so here's our preganglionic neuron cell body, preganglionic axon, comes out the ventral root, spinal nerve, white rami communicans, synapses, and then it can just go straight out to, I don't know, the heart or wherever it's going, to its effector, right? That's the straightforward one. But sometimes, instead, it's going to go back up by the gray one, and then go to a different chain to synapse first. And sometimes it's going to go to these collateral ganglia. So the collateral are also called prevertebral because they're typically sitting just on the ventral aspect of the vertebral bodies. And unlike the chain, these are unpaired. So there's no right or left side. There's just the one. And this is a picture of some of them because they're typically hanging out by, this is the aorta as it runs in the abdomen right along your vertebrae. So these are vertebral bodies right here. I have a couple other pictures. So the nerves that are formed by the fibers that wait to synapse until they get into the collateral ganglia have specific names for some weird reason. They're called splanchnic nerves. There's 3 of them. You don't really need to know that part, but there's 3 of them, and they contribute to this giant mass of nerves called the abdominal aortic plexus. It has a bunch of different ganglia. It then gives off a majority of the nerves that actually go to the organs of the abdominal and pelvic cavities. So of course, I'm laying out all this chain stuff and everything looks very well organized. And then there's this mess, which is why I threw in pictures a couple different times. So this is the same picture on the left, and then this is more of a diagrammatic one. And it's showing you the collaterals here, and then running to pelvic organs here, and kind of joining up with some parasympathetic axons from the sacral segments as well. Okay, so we don't need to know the details of this anatomy, but just kind of trying to explain that there's a lot of different pathways these guys take, which makes everything a little extra confusing. But regardless of the pathway, there's always 2 motor neurons. So there's the preganglionic and the postganglionic, regardless. Now there's another pathway for the sympathetic preganglionic neurons, because some of them go to the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal glands are paired glands of the endocrine system, and there's a couple different layers to it. You'll learn about the rest of it when you get to the endocrine system. But the adrenal medulla is the core or the center of the adrenal gland, and it's actually just highly specialized postganglionic sympathetic neurons that act as endocrine cells. So the medulla produces norepinephrine and epinephrine, and those are released in the blood as hormones of the sympathetic nervous system. So these are the hormones that increase your heart rate, increase your respiratory rate. They'll make you get all sweaty and hot, prep your muscles for action when needed. So instead of the postganglionic neurons then synapsing with an effector organ, instead they release their neurotransmitter into the blood as hormones. So it's kind of cool. So basically this is just a third option for a sympathetic ganglion. Jesus Christ. Okay. So adrenal glands, you'll learn more about them later. They're actually named because they're next to the kidneys. They're adrenal glands, and renal is the other term we use when we refer to the kidneys. And there's some adorable graphics associated with them when you start looking at pictures. This one's your reminder that they're involved in the fight or flight reflexes because they're dressed like little boxers. Okay, so we take all that and then we're going to compare what we just talked about to the parasympathetic nervous system. So this division, remember, everything's basically opposite. So they're craniosacral. The preganglionic fibers are long. The ganglia are actually right by their organs, so we call them terminal ganglia because they're right at the end of the pathway. And then the postganglionic fibers are super duper short, and honestly, I don't even know why they exist. So we look at the same diagram, but now instead of drawing out the postganglionics for sympathetic, we're drawing them out for parasympathetic. So we have a little bit coming from the sacral segments that goes to pelvic organs, Everything else is coming from the brainstem via several cranial nerves. So there are 4 cranial nerves that carry parasympathetic fibers. Their cell bodies are always in the brainstem. There are terminal ganglia by their organs. 3 out of 4 supply stuff in the head, because remember, the cranial nerves are just about the face, right? So the vagus nerve is the only one that leaves the head. It goes down and supplies the parasympathetic innervation for all the thoracic and abdominal organs. So for example, we have ganglia in our eyeballs for the parasympathetic fibers that innervate our like tear glands and stuff like that, as well as our muscles inside our eyes that dilate and constrict our pupils. There's a bunch of them near our salivary glands because there's going to be parasympathetic input there too. But then when we look at the pelvic organs, those are going to come, from the sacral segments. So the sacral spinal segments just have input into the pelvic organs, which is the genital and urinary systems. And then just a little bit, the last part of the rectum. So everything else is coming down from the vagus. And as you can see, their ganglia are all right. They're right there. Okay, so really, really long preganglionic fibers, terminal ganglia, really, really short postganglionic fibers. And of course, these guys are also going to be coming out by the ventral roots of their relevant spinal nerves, and they will also go join up with the pelvic splanchnic nerves, which remember the sympathetic guys form a lot of, so that they're all running the same pathways. They're taking the same freeway, basically. And this is just showing you how they're both getting to the same place for that dual innervation. Even though they're taking slightly different pathways. And then I know I put this in the other one, but again, the vagus does a lot. So remember that you can see kind of how important that is because it's carrying almost all of the parasympathetic information. Almost all the motor output from the parasympathetic is coming down the vagus. Okay, so to dig a little bit into the physiology, we're going to look really quick at the neurotransmitters, which isn't that much because most of our synapses use acetylcholine, which is awesome because we're used to that. It's our original neurotransmitter. Neurons whose fibers release acetylcholine are called cholinergic fibers. So when the axon releases acetylcholine at a synapse, it's cholinergic, okay? And then if they're not releasing acetylcholine, they're going to be releasing norepinephrine. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are very, very similar to each other, but norepinephrine is the one that gets released as a neurotransmitter. I don't know why. And because norepi and epi are part of the adrenergic neurotransmitter system, we call neurons that release this at synapses adrenergic fibers. Now, there are specific locations where both of these are used. And the easiest way to remember this is sympathetic postganglionic neurons are adrenergic. Everybody else is cholinergic. So it's pretty easy. And the reason is, I don't know the reason for why everything else is acetylcholine, just that clearly acetylcholine is a highly useful neurotransmitter and we like to use it in motor output. But the nice thing about all of our postganglionics using norepinephrine for the sympathetic is that when our adrenal medulla releases them as hormones into the blood, they can also have an effect at the effectors that are getting norepi from the synapses. So it gives a sympathetic nervous system a stronger effect when it has to act. Okay, so easiest way to remember is just that there's really only one place essentially that uses norepinephrine, and everybody else uses acetylcholine. So just like when we talked about neurotransmitters before, the actions of the synapses depend on the receptors, not the neurotransmitters. So both neurotransmitters can have either inhibitory or excitatory actions. It just depends on the particular receptor that's on that receiving end of the synapse. And then this is just what I showed you with the diagram before. So cholinergic fibers on all preganglionic axons, as well as parasympathetic postganglionic axons. Adrenergic fibers on sympathetic postganglionic axons, although there is an exception in that sweat glands actually use acetylcholine, which you don't really need to know. It's too much detail. But it's a weird exception, so throw it out there. Thought I had something else about receptors, but I guess I don't. Okay, that's fine, doesn't matter. All right, so most of the time, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions are sending signals to target organs. So there's a constant low-level communication from both divisions of the autonomic nervous system and most of their effector organs. This is very much like how there's always a little bit of stimulation to your skeletal muscles for muscle tone. So we call this autonomic tone. Because most of the actions of the divisions are opposing, this is a form of dynamic antagonism. So you can think about it very much like a scale. And a lot of the time, you know, you might be getting about equal weight on either side of the scale. And then sometimes one side gets heavier and it tilts, but then it can always tilt back the other way too. Okay, it just kind of depends on how much neurotransmitter each one's pouring out at any given time. And this allows for very precise control because they don't have to tweak very much to change the balance enough to have an effect. Now, sometimes one division dominates, of course. It's easier to think about that for the sympathetic because we know that when we are in a very stressful situation, that's going to dominate all of our tone. So we'll have very high sympathetic tone. But sometimes it's the parasympathetic as well. And in fact, our resting state is usually with a little bit more parasympathetic tone than sympathetic tone. We're not really wired to run sympathetic all the time. It should be kind of low level, just ready to go. It's not really good for us to be constantly at a high state of sympathetic tone. And then, as I said, there are some times where they work cooperatively, and I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. So, diagram again, high sympathetic tone, just for a visual. And then our one good cooperative example is sex. So sex actually requires cooperative control between both divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And that's because the initial steps of sexual stimulation in both men and women require high levels of parasympathetic tone, which makes sense. Like you should be in a physically safe space before you're going to have sex because it puts you in a vulnerable physical position, right? So if you think back to when our biggest dangers were like fire, flood, and bears and wolves and stuff, you're not gonna, be safe if you might get ambushed by a pack of wolves. So high parasympathetic tone is needed, and that's because in order to stimulate reproductive organs, you actually need to relax blood vessels to allow blood flow, and relaxation of things is typically a parasympathetic thing. But to finish off a sex act, you need higher sympathetic tone. It's required both for ejaculation in men and then the vaginal contractions that usually accompany orgasm in women. So both need to work together or you're not going to have a productive round of sex. So that's our example. Some other comparisons between them because they just insist on being opposite to each other. So the parasympathetic effects are more localized than the sympathetic. And that's for a couple of reasons. So first of all, because the preganglionic neurons typically only synapse with a few postganglionic neurons. So it's a very precise effect when they fire. And acetylcholine breaks down pretty fast due to the enzymatic effects in the synapses. So their actions are fairly short-lived. And that's not, neither one of those things are bad. It's just statement of fact, okay? In comparison, sympathetic effects tend to be more diffuse because the preganglionic axons branch a lot and therefore they have a lot of synapses. So one preganglionic sympathetic neuron firing is going to have a more broad effect. And the other thing is that their effects last longer because we're typically having a simultaneous hormonal release of norepinephrine and epinephrine into the blood. And that's going to prolong the effect because they're going to circulate in the blood for a while and they're going to also be triggering these systematic effects of sympathetic stimulation. Okay, so even in the specificity of their effects and the duration of their effects, they're very opposite to each other. Some things that are unique to the sympathetic division because of those few effectors that don't have dual innervation, blood pressure maintenance is probably the most important one. So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for maintaining the appropriate level of constriction on blood vessels to maintain blood pressure, as well as direct blood to whichever organs need it in any given moment. Because as you'll learn when you get to the cardiovascular system, we don't have enough blood in our bodies for every single thing to have all the blood all the time. So we have to direct it in a specific way. Because a lot of body temperature regulation is by blood vessel tone in the skin, as well as control over sweat glands, the sympathetic division has a lot of responsibility for thermal regulation. Not sole, but a lot. It's also in charge of releasing an enzyme called renin from the kidneys, which is involved in a blood pressure pathway too, which you'll learn more about later. And then that systematic release of epinephrine and norepinephrine in the blood from the adrenal gland has a variety of metabolic effects. So it overall increases the metabolic rate of cells. It increases blood glucose levels by acting on the liver. And it stimulates our adipose to mobilize fats. And the idea behind these metabolic effects is that if you are in a fight or flight situation, you want to make sure that your skeletal muscles, your heart muscle, that they have enough fuel to properly supply whatever actions they're about to take. And so these things, along with the other actions of the sympathetic nervous system, are going to help ensure that that's the case. So these are things that aren't countered by this parasympathetic division. It's just that when there's more sympathetic tone, we get more of this, and when there's less sympathetic tone, it kind of dials it back, if that makes sense. It's more of an on-off switch, like how we control skeletal muscle. Now, the autonomic nervous system does not work without supervision. So higher brain centers do have some amount of control. So we're going to touch on the areas that have the most input into autonomic function and how they're able to influence all those motor neurons. So the major control center is going to be that hypothalamus. There is some amount of control that we can have with our cerebral cortex. So sort of indirect conscious control, mostly by way of the limbic system or sometimes the hypothalamus. So basically, our emotional state is going to have a major impact on our autonomic tone and autonomic outputs, which I think makes sense. And we kind of talked about that a little bit when we covered the limbic system before, right? You know, like if you get really angry or you get really scared, your body's going to respond by increasing sympathetic tone. And if you're feeling really happy or relaxed or content, then you're probably going to have higher parasympathetic tone because your body needs to match the tone of the autonomic nervous system with, you know, what your body needs to be ready to do next. And it uses emotions to gauge whether or not that's, or how to do that. So this is just kind of showing like, ooh, it's coming from the hypothalamus and there's links up to the cortex and the limbic system. And, you know, then there's going to be connections to the brainstem because of various things. And you know, it's in the book, so I threw it in. The limbic system hypothalamic connections, as I said, are important for appropriate autonomic responses to emotional stress, okay? So again, it's knowing how to manage your autonomic tone based on your emotional state, because your emotional state should reflect whether or not you need to be ready for fight or flight or whether you are safe to relax. But that's, of course, also why, you know, things that cause us anxiety are going to cause higher levels of sympathetic tone. Even though we should be safe, there's no physical threat, our body still reacts as if there is because of this connection. And then this was the picture of the limbic system that they threw in the book, and I was like, all right, sure, here, limbic system, reminder, cool. This one's from a different book, showing you those in a little bit more of a flow format, and also showing you how the reticular system in the brainstem is also going to have a fairly direct influence, but ultimately the hypothalamus is the major controller of the autonomic nervous system from higher brain areas. So I throw this one in because biofeedback is kind of what we call it when we learn to take some conscious control over some of our autonomic parameters. And usually the way we do that is by measuring them in such a way that we can see or otherwise be aware of them. And then we can learn to use things that we can control, like our breathing and our emotions, to alter it. So a lot of the things that people do, they learn how to alter their like heart rate, or even their like brain waves to some extent by looking at measurements of their heart rate and learning how to control that. So that's in general called biofeedback. And some people, I think, you know, really like it more than others. I don't know how important it is in the grand scheme of things, but it's certainly very interesting. So that takes us to the reflex arcs of the autonomic nervous system. So we're just going to go through a couple of them, but we're going to start by comparing it to the somatic reflexes we looked at last time. Now remember that all reflex arcs have the same 5 components. So visceral or autonomic reflexes are no different. We're going to have a sensory receptor, we're going to have a sensory neuron, and remember sometimes those are the same thing. We're going to have an integration center, even if that's just a single synapse, a motor neuron, and an effector. The 2 main differences are that we always have 2 motor neurons in the motor neuron step, because that's how autonomic output is compared to the 1 motor neuron of somatic. And the afferent fibers that are typically playing the role of sensory neuron, they're usually visceral. So we're not responding to the same types of stimuli here. We're responding to almost always enteroceptors. and they're monitoring internal changes. So maybe it's chemical changes in the blood, maybe it's stretch of hollow organs or irritation of the viscera. Things like that are going to be what trigger the sensory receptors and send information up the sensory neuron. So we're going to look at just two examples. This is just the diagram of the visual differences between somatic and visceral. So autonomic's up here, showing you the two motor neuron pathway. And then remember those varicosities that release neurotransmitter instead of those specific synapses. And then this one's the somatic with a single motor neuron, which is a neuromuscular junction. So this is our diagram of the autonomic reflex arc. It looks very similar to the one we looked at before. The difference is that, of course, this is running from the lateral horn, synapsing in, they drew it like a sympathetic chain ganglia, but it could be any autonomic ganglion, coming down the white ramus, back up the gray ramus, and going out to an effector. So the first one we're going to look at is the pupillary light reflex. And you can actually kind of play with this at home. Easier if you have another person, but you could totally do this in a mirror if you really wanted to. And basically, it's the automatic adjustments of the size of your pupil based on the amount of light hitting your retina, which is the back of your eye. We'll talk about later. So there's two sets of smooth muscle in your eye that control the size of your pupil. And the one that gets activated in this case is the pupillary constrictor muscle, which makes your pupil shrink in size when you're exposed to higher levels of light. The interesting thing about this reflex is that it is bilateral, which means that regardless of which eye is exposed to a high level of light, both pupils will respond and constrict. So that's what this is actually showing. This is like your eye is mostly dilated because you're in a fairly dark room. Shine a light in your right eye and both eyes constrict. Shine a light in your left eye and both eyes constrict again. So the way that it works is that the receptors for this are going to actually be the receptors for vision, which we'll talk about later. So the light hits the back of the eye. Your sensory neurons send the information to your brain by the optic nerve. So remember that's cranial nerve too. Optic. And it's going to synapse. This is showing it in the back of your brain, but I'm pretty sure that this is happening in your brainstem. Oh yeah, there they are. Okay, so when light is dim, overall, there's a little reflex in your cervical vertebrae that responds to dim light by actually contracting the opposite muscle, which is the pupillary dilator muscle, and your eyes dilate to let in more light because it's not very bright out, okay? And then when bright light's perceived, it gets processed by a reflex center in the midbrain, and then we're gonna send out control, so the constrictor muscle, and we're gonna constrict. Now, the reason why it crosses over is because of the way that the processing occurs. So there's a nucleus in the hypothalamus that controls the constriction of the opposite eye. Please tell me I have a diagram. This is the weird diagram in your book. Okay, so the reason why this works is because when light hits either eye, both sides of the brain actually get stimulated because half of the sensory neurons from each eye stay on one side and half of them cross over to the other. Remember that optic chiasm we talked about? And so both sides of the brain get hit by the bright light regardless of which side is actually has the light shined on. And so then both sides activate that midbrain reflex that leads to constriction of both eyes. All right, So this crossing over or decussation of some of the sensory receptors or the sensory neurons is what's responsible for the bilateral response. So we have bilateral integration caused by bilateral sensory neuron signals, and that causes the response to be bilateral as well. If it's not, it indicates an issue somewhere along the line in the pathway. And then this one's a nice little summary too that you're free to read, but you don't need to know any information here that isn't in the previous slides. I just found it while I was looking for images and I thought it was nice, so I kept it in. Anybody have questions about PLRs, which is how we abbreviate that? No? Okay. So the other one we're going to look at is the baroreceptor reflex. And the baroreceptor reflex is how we, or one of the ways that blood pressure is regulated. So baroreceptors are stretch receptors located in blood vessels. And in particular, the ones we care about are in the walls of the carotid arteries, so the arteries that run up our neck, supply our brain with blood, as well as the aorta, so the first artery coming off of the heart. And they respond to stretch. So blood pressure will be pushing on the inner walls of the blood vessels. Higher blood pressure pushes more, which stretches the walls more, and then vice versa, lower blood pressure stretches less. So that's how we use stretch receptors to monitor blood pressure. So the sensory is carried by cranial nerves, 9 and 10, for the different baroreceptors. And the integration is going to occur in the cardiovascular regulatory center in the medulla. If blood pressure goes, oh, no. If blood pressure goes down and there's not as much stretch, then we're going to want to increase it again by stimulating the heart and stuff. And I say that because that's the one that's on here, so to make sure that I said it right. All right, so we're going to then send out sympathetic efferents because the sympathetic nervous system is in charge of boosting that. So this is actually going to increase the rate of the heart. Sorry, I thought I had a whole separate slide on this. Increase the rate of the heart, as well as increase the effort that the heart makes. And that's going to cause more blood to flow and boost the blood pressure. And if the blood pressure gets too high, then we have the reverse response where we want to back off of heart rate, back off of effort to allow the blood pressure to fall. But usually it's this one. This response is the reason why it exists. It's not so much for high blood pressure, it's for low blood pressure. Okay, so that's baroreceptor reflex. And you can see that not only do we have this instant nervous system response, but by releasing epinephrine from the adrenal medulla, we have a fairly prolonged response to help maintain keeping up blood pressure by having a longer acting effect on the heart. There are two kinds of autonomic reflexes. So we call them short reflexes and long reflexes. Short reflexes don't involve the central nervous system. And we think it's because because of the use of the two motor neuron pathway that we can sometimes have feedback that kind of just goes at the level of that ganglion and comes right back around. And that's basically how a lot of functions of the enteric nervous system are. So all of the nervous system components in the digestive system. So we'll talk a little bit about those later when we get to the digestive system. But the rest of them are called long reflexes because, you know, we actually have sensory stuff going all the way to the spinal cord or brain, and there's central nervous system processing. So just to be aware of that, because that's not how somatic works. We don't have any short somatic reflexes. So this is showing how a sensory receptor could just synapse with the second or postganglionic motor neuron and have an effect without having to go up to the spinal cord or the brain and have integration at the level of the preganglionic neuron. All right, that's the difference between long and short. One last thing on the autonomic nervous system. So although we're not always aware of visceral sensations, a lot of them never enter our level of consciousness, right? Like we do not know what our blood pressure is or have any awareness of it. Sometimes, especially when pain is involved, if a visceral sensation is strong enough, it can be felt. But it doesn't always feel like where it's actually coming from. And there's a couple reasons for that. For one thing, we don't actually have somatotopy for visceral receptor input. So our brain doesn't actually receive that input in a mapping of the body. So it's not always sure where it's coming from. The other reason is that there can be cross-stimulation of sensory input at the level of the spinal cord. So visceral sensations that enter the spinal cord at the same level as somatic ones can be confused for each other. And so the result of that is something called referred pain. We will feel somatic pain in response to visceral sensory stimulation. And this is so consistent that there are maps of the skin and technically muscle and bone of which organs correspond to which areas. Now, this isn't going to be identical for every person. There's obviously going to be a lot of range because it depends on how you developed and stuff. But this is fairly consistent, and some of them we're familiar with. So, for example, the heart is most likely to make the left side of your chest and your left arm hurt. We know that because that's one of the common signs of a heart attack. Although, interesting fact, that's actually more common in men, and women don't often have those classic heart attack signs. Look that up at some point because people don't always recognize signs of a heart attack in women. Another one we're rather familiar with is your appendix typically causes visceral pain in your lower right abdomen. A lot of these are weird and we might not recognize them, but I want you to note that the kidneys have a giant area of visceral pain. Any of that hurting could actually be caused by your kidneys, which is a little bit nuts. Okay, so we have this whole map because of the crosstalk at the level of the spinal cord and the lack of somatotopy of visceral sensory input. All right, so any questions about autonomic nervous system? Well, then that concludes that. Let me turn off everything and then we'll reset for